time I give, every time I give any lecture, any session, I pick and choose what information I'm going to present. And I don't expect everyone to accept that, but that's the way it is. So the first part I just want to outline are the objectives of this particular session and how we go about trying to achieve those goals. So in exploring the relationship between the US and China, I'm dealing only with the most current issues in front of us. We know that there's increasing tension. The question in part is, can those tensions be reduced? And remember always, this is not about any particular administration. This has to do with the perspective I'm going to put you into in order to try to help if you were the main China expert, as I've listed in number 5. But before you can even do that, we have to have a discussion about what our national security interests are or may be in the Far East. And then finally, just suppose China does decide to invade Taiwan. The second part, as I've discussed, are what I call Boggs rules. Now, the reason for this is to prevent crosstalk. And this is not, again, please keep this in mind. This is not a critique or criticism of any administration. The idea here is for you as an audience to gain some insights, hopefully, into what's going on between the US and China in particular, but also to engage in a discussion. But bring your questions or comments to me, and I will feed them back. We do have microphones which we can hand to you for you to be heard adequately. And I just want to be sure that we do that so no one feels like, quite literally, you can't be heard. Now, to lead off, I am going to just hit some historical elements that I think are important to keep in mind, because they set the foundation for some of the things that are going on now. But this is not a complete history of anything related to the Far East. And I use this particular political cartoon because it emphasizes what we're going to talk about today. But notice the football. What does it say? It says global domination. Is that what the US perspective is on our own activities? And how, if that's true, does that relate to those particular goals which China may have? Is China looking at global domination? Now, I bring this up as a brief history because there's some conflict in understanding, or at least some deficiencies in understanding. First of all, just 25,000 BCE, there were indigenous people in Taiwan. The Chinese, as an ethnic group, with my limited research on this, did not really arrive in Taiwan at all until 239 CE. And even then, they didn't claim the land as part of China. It was a separate entity. European powers arrived in the 1620s, the Dutch in particular, but it wasn't until 1683 that the Qing dynasty in mainland China formally annexed Taiwan. Now keep that in mind, because some of the things you'll hear from President Xi and others is that Taiwan has always been part of China. And you can see, at least historically, depending on where you want to draw the line, much like Putin's claims about Ukraine going back to Kiev and the Rus people who established Kiev, they used that as an indication that we have a historic claim, not just a presence. And that changes the dynamics completely. Japan annexed Taiwan in the first Sino-Japanese Wars, you'll see 1895. It was returned after World War II. Then in 1949, when the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek lost the Civil War and evacuated to Taiwan, they established, when they arrived there, the nationalist Chinese government, still with claims that they were the legitimate government, including mainland China. The reality on the ground was quite different. The Chinese communists controlled the mainland. Truman, look at this, 1950, US will not be involved with China and Taiwan. And shortly afterwards, the Korean War erupts. In 1954, there are some outlying islands not too far from the mainland that for some reason or other, which I can't explain, were still under nationalist Chinese control. Quemoy and Matsu were the two names of those islands that I'm familiar with, but there are different names applied to them. They did that again in 58. And then, most significantly, the Kuomintang was displaced from the Security Council and the PRC took over in 1971. Now, I put this up because this and the next slide tell us a bit about the ideology that at least has been expressed by the Chinese Communist Party in its beginning. So here, and some of you have heard this before, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Our principle is that the party commands the gun, and the gun must never be allowed to command the party. Yet, having guns, we can create party organizations and so on, which the 8th Root Army is created in northern China. That's back in the early days when the conflict between the nationalists and the communists was most prevalent. And he talks about creating mass movements. All things grow out of the barrel of a gun. According to the Marxist theory of the state, the army is the chief component of state power. Whoever wants to seize and retain state power must have a strong army. We're advocates of the omnipotence of revolutionary war. That is good, not bad, it is Marxist. Guns, the Russian Communist Party created socialism. We shall create a democratic republic. Now think about the term, democratic republic. What does that mean? Within their context, within this very document, compared to how we think about a so-called democratic republic, are they the same? Or do they really have very distinctly different features that alter the whole nature of how a country is run? Experience in the class struggle teaches us it is only the power of the gun that the working class and laboring masses can defeat the bourgeoisie and landlords. We may say that only with guns can the whole world be transformed. Now, this is not the foundational document. It's not their constitution, nor is it really quite the same as our Declaration of Independence. But what it does do is create the underpinning, the philosophy upon which the Chinese Communist Party established its control and eventually has become the ascendant and accepted legitimate government of mainland China. Now, as we look at this, there are several features we will talk about. I'm going to run through these fairly quickly so we can open the discussion up. But I want to have you keep in mind what these features are so that we have a template on which to proceed with our discussion. Now, this is a complicated slide, and I don't intend to read the whole thing to you because it would be a waste of time. But it is in the slides, and it will be in the recording when you get it. What I want to point out here is that Taiwan's approach has a lot of ambivalence built into its relationship with mainland China. Somewhat similar to Hong Kong, right, which was governed primarily as a colony by the British and was turned over to mainland China under an agreement that somehow there would be two systems operative. And I think that it was turned over in 1999, or right close to that date. There was for them, that is those in Hong Kong, an expectation of how the central government would treat them. And over the past 20 years or 25 years, that has changed utterly. And it's created enormous difficulties in Hong Kong for the people who were there and grew up under British authority compared to those who are growing up under the CCP. Taiwan has not ignored what has gone on in Hong Kong. So the idea from their standpoint is that if we submit to the demands of the CCP, that we become an acknowledged part of mainland China's government, the CCP, then the CCP in time will make Taiwan what Hong Kong has become. So keep that part in mind. And you'll see that under the 2005 anti-secession law, conditions for using force against Taiwan. So 20 years ago, all right, mandates non-peaceful means if Taiwan formally declares independence. And Beijing has broadened its view to encompass basically everything, political, diplomatic, and international, in terms of how it's going to view Taiwan's actions, and will use its own judgment to determine if those actions comport with what the CCP's ultimate goal is, which is to unify Taiwan or force Taiwan to become part of mainland China. Now, officials in the United States have been very careful in how we characterize Taiwan and how we characterize our own relationship with it. But we have been stepping on the CCP's toes a fair amount in the last 10 years or so. Some of you may remember that Representative Pelosi made a trip to Taiwan. And that engendered considerable feedback from the CCP. They were extremely unhappy about it. And they had certain threats that they were offering as a result. Now, this is one fundamental question. I only leave this map up because although it's in that magazine that I brought, what it emphasizes is what's called the 9-dash line, which includes a little bit of this segment that is the early yellow line down through the South China Sea. The second line is what's called the first island chain, and the second, somewhat lighter yellow, is the second island chain. And then some of the designations you'll see have to do with the major belt and road initiatives, which we're going to talk about. The significance of the 9-dash line is basically that despite this line bordering Vietnam, as an example, the Chinese government feels that this is their territory. Keep that in mind. The first island chain, in a sense, is something that the Chinese themselves have said represents, we'll call it an important security line. So this is a little different from what you claim. But what you're basically saying is my primary sphere of influence is going to be that first island chain. And the second island chain, well, that's later on. Now I want you to look at that carefully and just recognize something that may remind you a bit of World War II. And the extent to which the Japanese were able to reach all these areas for a period of time and control them. Why this area? Just keep that in mind. It's not for us to answer today. Now, what about China's economy? Considered the second most powerful economy in the world. Year-on-year growth is pretty substantial. When we talk about in the United States of having a 3 or 4% growth in GDP, we're ecstatic. And the Chinese are ahead of that. Does that mean they have a more powerful economy than we? Ultimately overtake us? You may have heard that narrative a number of times. And if that is the case, what are the implications for the United States and how do we deal with that? You look at the different numbers that I put up. Again, I'm not going to read it. It's going to be on the slides. But there are a couple of little things in here that are a little bit troubling. Real estate drags down growth. We've had our own issues here in the United States with real estate, housing. You've heard about it. It's one of the very reasons that New York is going to have a new mayor, is because of the cost of living, particularly housing. Fixed asset investment contracted a bit. 0.5% doesn't sound like much, but it's the reflection of what it means in confidence. And you'll see that the private sector investment also shows a reduction in confidence in where the country is headed. Now, here is one of the more critical, more important elements that China is facing. And I want you to think seriously about this as we move in the discussion phase, because it has enormous implications throughout the world. Notice the projected decline. That's more than half in 75 years. Think about that. 75 years, not a long period of time, and you're going to lose over 600 million in your overall population. Why is that happening? And on top of it, what does it mean about the internal demographics? Well, we're talking about that. With their one-child policy, China prevented 400 million births. Now, you may remember back when this was initiated, if you paid attention to it, China was very concerned about their overall population explosion or growth. And how do they manage that when they have very limited resources to feed everyone? Though they still can feed themselves. They're right on the cusp, but they're able to manage it. But notice the gender imbalance. The gender imbalance should be thrown out with this. 34 million more men than women. What does that tell you? Well, there are a lot of guys out there who are not likely to hook up and have children of their own, okay? But then you have even more that we're going to come to in a moment. Young people entering the workforce, we hear about that in terms of Social Security. We used to have 4 to 1, now we're down to something like 2 to 1 supporting Social Security. Unemployment. Now, notice that in October, it's 5.2%, a little high, but not awful. But look at youth unemployment. And now, even if you believe the information that the CCP sends out for public consumption, there's strong evidence that the unemployment rate is much higher in rural areas. And that represents another big problem that's, in a sense, being swept under the rug. However, retail sales actually went up, which is kind of an interesting thing to look at given some of the other information I gave you. Personal savings rate. You know, we complain in the United States about how people aren't saving. But what they're seeing here is that too high a savings means people aren't willing to go out and buy things. They're not sure what the value of their currency will be, but remember, if you hold your currency in a bank and you're not getting much of an interest rate, with inflation, you're losing value all the time. So this represents some of the issues China's dealing with. The consequences, I've already talked about a little bit, but when you only have one child, and some of you may have had only one child, I won't get into he's touching me, or she did it. When you only have one child, then you got a real problem. But entitlement, social development, unregistered children, if they're not registered, and that was a way of trying to avoid the repercussions that existed under the one-child rule, that now, how do you get them educated, healthcare, and so on? And then there's this psychological and cultural strain, reversing the mindset. It's actually been more than that. There's some good information that's come out that indicates single Chinese women have less interest in getting married, much as you see here in the United States. But more importantly, if they get married, they're not interested in having a big family. Remember from the discussion in Ukraine, the replacement rate is somewhere around 2.1. That's if you have a general replacement number. But few are willing to have even 2 children, much less 3. So the idea of replacement fits in to that decline in overall population that I talked about in the earlier slide. And on top of all of this, you have a reduced working age number, and you could lose 5 to 10 million annually. That means you have an aging population. And what happens there? And again, we've heard numbers about, I think men could retire at 65 and women at 55, something of that nature. But elder costs, also a big issue. So we keep these in mind. Now, why does this matter? Because information like this is known to the CCP, and they're going to act on it. It's going to be one of those influences that push them in a particular direction. And we'll come to that later. What else is happening in China? The fourth plenum. This is when all the top members are supposed to get together. It's a huge event, and it's of critical importance in setting the agenda for the country going forward. But notice what happened. How many didn't attend? 27 members of 47 of the People's Liberation Army did not attend. Of the 27, 9 were dismissed, 14 had not been seen. We don't think they've come down with bad colds or fallen out of windows, but it's not quite clear where they are, what's happened to them. And she had been promoting a strong campaign against corruption, but it may have been flipped on its head and used to target his own supporters. Just one new military appointment, bypassing 7 expected, including some of his closest associates. How is this going to influence Xi's desire to stay in power? What is he going to do in reaction to that? He'll preside over a central military commission, but it's barely got a quorum. Questions are being asked if he can keep control. Now, there are also some regional issues that are affecting China and how China is going to engage with the rest of the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Well, China's deepened its relationship with Russia, particularly with buying oil and gas, as an attempt to circumvent any possibilities that her imports of oil and gas by sea could be interrupted. It's a cushion. But in addition, why else would China support Russia, with whom they've had literally centuries of conflict, sometimes into actual open fighting, like along the Amur River a number of years back, which some people were fearful could lead to a nuclear escalation. In addition, with support to Russia, are Western sanctions now going to be levied against China in order to cut off the flow of money that funds Russia's ability to fight in Ukraine? So, Moscow and Beijing view Ukraine and Taiwan as interconnected on a broader struggle against Western dominance. And this gets us back to the ideological questions that we're going to have to address in our discussion group. And then finally, we deal with North Korea. China's had a somewhat ambivalent relationship with North Korea, even though they sent 1 million people to fight during the Korean War. In fact, it was more than that, because they took almost 1 million casualties in the couple of years that fighting was going on. But the point is that China doesn't want North Korea to become a failed state, because in part it would mean that whatever happened in North Korea would flow across into her borders. She doesn't want to deal with that. What is China doing elsewhere that is of significance to the global order, and particularly may have an effect on US national interests? China has made enormous contributions to develop this Belt and Road Initiative. And what you'll see from it is it extends all the way across Central Asia, all the way to Europe. Notice there's even a connection to Germany and the Netherlands, Italy and Greece, Turkey, and Africa. Notice also the connection around India. India is both a problem for China because of border conflicts that have existed there, again, almost for centuries, but most recently since India became independent in 1948 from the British. And notice that China has some sovereign rights in Patagonia. In other words, they set up a satellite monitoring station, and basically in that agreement said to the government, this is our land. It's like our embassy. You can't come in unless you're invited. It's an interesting thing to agree to. And then why would you agree, and what are the implications of that? Now, the area where there's the greatest conflict going on a regular basis is in the South China Sea. Why? A couple of reasons. It is a major trade route. Merchant ships pass through this area in enormous numbers. What else? Natural resources. Which ones? Oil and gas. Where are they located? Along the Spratlys in yellow. Well, who else is there? Well, there's the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, and Malaya. So you end up saying to yourself, okay, you want that stuff. Is there anything else? Fishing. Oh, okay. So we need to feed our population. We need fish. Okay, except what has China done in the process? Two major things. She took shoals, which are not islands. They're defined differently in laws of the sea. Brought in material and created artificial islands. That allows them to at least maintain that they have a legal reason, a legitimate reason for controlling that territory and the surrounding territory. They initially said they wouldn't militarize. Well, that didn't happen. They did. They built long runways and put military equipment on those artificial islands. In addition, their so-called Coast Guard and their what they call their militia, which is part of their actual fishing fleet, is under the control of the CCP and is extremely aggressive in driving off fishing vessels from other countries, especially the Philippines, where they've rammed ships, fishing ships, or they've deluged them with water cannon, and they've made a number of attempts at a place I believe is called Thompson's Shoal, where there was a wrecked Philippine ship, but it's above water, and the Philippine government sent people to maintain it. And then, of course, they have to be supplied regularly. And when the Philippines try to send supplies, the Coast Guard, the Chinese Coast Guard, interferes, tries to keep them from doing it. So, the other part of this is that China has reached out globally to establish her footprint in a very powerful way, to try to establish friendships in other locations. And in particular, you'll see that China has viewed Pakistan as a reliable ally. Actually helped them build a port which would allow the Chinese Navy, it's called the PLAN, People's Liberation Army / Navy, to dock there and have insulated it from the regular Pakistan government influence in that area. They've also been trying to work with India to wean them away, and there's been a number of initiatives that have occurred, even though they've had conflicts. But they really are trying hard to disrupt the relationships that India may develop with the United States. And these are also influenced by tariffs and the war, as you've seen. I show this because this is South America, where the Chinese operate satellite monitoring stations. And the idea here is that, are these just for satellite monitoring, or do they have another possible purpose? And can they do certain things which may not be helpful to us in our particular way? I also want to mention that you may have heard just less than a year ago that China operated the ports on either end of the Panama Canal, and what that meant in terms of transit through the Panama Canal, and if it were disrupted. You remember the disruption that occurred in the Suez Canal when a large merchant ship got stuck and blocked the Suez Canal. Doesn't take a lot to bollocks up something like that. Now, what about Africa? I'm going to come back, Bob. You'll save it for now. This is another example of how trade and investment have changed. Look at the trade and investment growth 27-fold in 25 years. China's built 100,000 kilometers of roads, 10,000 kilometers of railways. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. And just one province alone traded 30 billion in digital and green issues to promote development. Now, there's a forum, China-African Cooperation, 10 partnerships to deal with important issues, including military, security ties, and even expand their influence further. I'm not going to get into the Sahel and some other regions where there's great conflict with jihadists. It's really threatening governments in those regions. But there's evidence that China at least has a way of influencing what will happen through supply. But the other parts we're hearing about a lot are the critical minerals. This is something where currently China controls much of what are called rare earth minerals. What that really means is it's very hard to find them and mine them. They're not necessarily very rare. And just today, there was an article on a discovery in Alaska where we found a valley with graphite. You think, why does that matter? But graphite matters because not only is it used in many things that we need today, but it also is a site where many of these rare earth minerals can be found. So it's going to be very interesting to see where that comes from. And you may have heard that we discovered in the United States another location where there's a large amount of lithium, and I think it was in Arkansas, if I remember correctly. So just keep those things in mind as well. So I've mentioned these things before. China supports Russia, harassment of Chinese students. In the United States, China actually set up police forces. And I think there were at least one or two in New York City itself. And these were finally being shut down when people realized what they were used for: to intimidate the students, threaten their families at home, and encourage them to spy. By that, gather information, send it back to the homeland where it could be used. And you may have heard recently that there were two biologists from China at the University of Michigan who were caught bringing in viruses and other things that they were allegedly going to study, but they were doing it illegally. So what does that mean? Okay. Again, just keep those in mind. Suppression at home, if you've bothered to read at all about the Falun Gong and the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, you'll know what I'm talking about. Forced organ donation, the United States Congress recently passed a resolution condemning this. In other words, it's no longer just rumor. Forced organ donation has been going on for a fairly long time. And if you bother to look at this newspaper, the Epoch Times, you'll learn a great deal more about it than you might ever want to know. But it's an important element, and I think it can no longer be denied. And if you're not aware, Shunyan is a dance troupe here based in New York, upstate New York, that travels around the world, except to China, and does performances based on what it calls the old Chinese stories. But in it, they criticize the CCP, and as a result, they have been attacked mercilessly by the CCP, including lodging lawsuits in New York against Shenyang. All right, green energy. Oh my. They're still building a lot of coal plants. And the point is that China clearly needs a great deal of energy, and they're going to do what they can to get it. And it doesn't matter that they have the second largest economy in the world. The Paris Accords mean nothing to them. Right? They are completely unimportant. Now, the other part is farmland. Now, remember, we're looking at this only from the standpoint of China. We're not talking about Canada, which actually owns much more property in the United States. But the importance here is, does any of this matter? And then why would they want property in the United States? And you may have seen some initiatives that some states are actually pushing forward to prevent any group, person, organization linked, however tenuously, back to the CCP will not be allowed to buy property. Some of this property is next to military bases in the United States. All right? It's all there. This is not made up fanciful stuff. Now, I mentioned this because you've heard about perhaps China's involvement in chips and how we need those chips for a lot of different purposes. Cranes in our ports are often based on chips which come from China. And the question would be, is there a way to disrupt the function of those chips so those cranes don't operate? Well, again, we speculate, but here's something that just came out recently. There were a whole bunch of electric buses that were part of the green energy initiatives, and they discovered that the buses could be accessed remotely from China, and they could just disable the bus. Well, that's interesting. So the response was, let's take the SIM cards out. Except when you do that, the bus doesn't know where it is. So now you got another problem. Denmark is looking into it. They're having the same problem, as is the UK. So the point is that from the perspective we have, the issue is China a benign competitor, or do they have some other agenda in mind which is potentially dangerous? And I mentioned this. Authorities found a SIM card network in New York that China's operating. 200,000 SIM cards in New Jersey, which can send 30 million texts every minute. Empty apartments were found. Okay? And this by an ABC News contributor who was formerly with the Secret Service. Benign or dangerous? Finally, the new Prime Minister, Takaichi, told a parliamentary committee this: blockade of Taiwan would create a survival-threatening situation for Japan that could compel Tokyo to deploy its self-defense forces. The response by Xi Jinping, Chinese consul in Osaka, that filthy neck that barged in on its own. I've got no choice but to cut it off without a moment's hesitation. Are you prepared for that? Oops. Do you think he said that on his own? Do you think he didn't have to clear that with the government in Beijing? And Japan is engaged in its biggest military buildup since World War II. All right, so now this is your job. You are the chief advisor related to China affairs, and the president has asked you these questions, which you are to answer. All right, let's take the first one. Is China a competitor or an enemy? Do we have the microphones? Who wants to start? Come on, somebody chime in. Robert?
Yes.
Which? Both?
Yes. All the above.
Okay. Do you handle those differently if you view it as a competitor or an enemy?
You have to deal with both.
Okay, very good.
They both compete and they also represent a major threat.
Okay.
And you've got to figure out a balance. And at this point, we have not figured that out.
Well, you're the China advisor. So you're going to say we're both competitors and an enemy. All right. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, well, I'd say both too, but I think the competition is on a kind of a day-to-day basis, short term. The enemy is on a kind of a longer term basis. And to compete economically is kind of something we're more used to, I think. But rooting out these chips in the buses and the students who are intimidated to spy on us and so forth is a different matter. We just have to fight that enemy, so to speak. We have to develop a good kind of counterintelligence.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in on that particular issue? All right. Now, does ideology play a role? Someone else. Someone else. Put a hand up. Is the CCP ideology intrinsically different from that we believe we have? Anyone? Come on, don't be afraid to speak up. I mean, this is an open forum. No one? So you have no views of what America's ideology is intrinsically. Remember, I pointed out the issue of what we call a democratic republic. All right? Is that foundation the same or very close to what the CCP maintains as a democratic republic? Go ahead.
It depends on what state you're talking about.
Well, remember, you're the China advisor, so we're going to get away from that kind of thing. Greg, I want you to answer it more seriously. You're talking as the China advisor to the administration.
China is our enemy ideologically, commercially, military.
Okay. All right. So taking that, one of the things that you need to understand, perhaps this is, again, getting too much in the weeds. Despite all of the so-called perversions that we all hear about almost daily in how we select and elect our representatives, do you consider this primarily, at least, a substantial influence of the general population to affect the outcome of elections? I'm not saying it's perfect. That's not the question. You don't have to answer it right now, but I'll give you the other perspective. How is it done in China? Does anyone know?
Barrel of a gun.
Well, in a sense, it's top down.
Yes.
So the top organization within the CCP selects down file, down ballot. And then from there, it's selected further down ballot and down ballot. In other words, there isn't an issue where you can go out and collect a bunch of signatures and get yourself put on the ballot. Okay? All right. Yes.
One of the questions that the people I know in China and the people who are Chinese or in America that I know ask me over and over again is, why do you people not select your elite to run your country?
Okay, now wait a minute. That's a different question from you're a China advisor. This isn't a matter of you trying to answer that kind of question to the Chinese. This is a matter of ideological principles. All right, and we're not going to go into it. If you want to learn more about that, come to my lectures in history, and I mean that seriously.
So just one note.
Yes.
That does apply in a sense because, as I understand it, a very large number of Chinese leadership comes from preparation, from the government putting people into programs and then starting them at a low level and building them and so forth.
But how does that change the relationship between the United States and China? We're talking not about how we select our politicians to represent us. We're talking about not a better system or a worse system. We're talking about a different system. So, from the standpoint of principle, this country, from its inception, has focused on the individual playing a distinct role in who the representatives are to be, and within the limits prescribed by the Constitution, to restrain their power as best as possible, admittedly imperfectly. The Chinese Communist Party does not do that. There is one party, and that party makes all the decisions. The ground up has very little to do except accept the consequences. All right? Yes.
When you had the quote from Mao, and he talked about democratic republic, I read that to being economically democratic. In other words, no more rich people, and everybody's going to have a certain economic security. I don't think that's present now. The way the country is ruled is, as you described, top down and so forth. But the more current rulers are allowing people to become rich.
Right, but I want to stop you there for a minute. Remember what this conversation is about. I'm talking about, is there an ideological difference between the two countries which is incompatible? Right? That is a fundamental question, not whether one is better than the other or whether there's an economic benefit or addressment. Oh, wait a minute, please. I want to let her talk first. Is to see if ideological differences, like I pointed out on the talk on Gaza, and as we talked about in the session on Ukraine, they're intrinsic ideological differences. And depending on how you're going to engage requires you not just acknowledging them, but understanding where there are points at which you can agree or disagree. Yes.
Historically, even before communism, China, it was about preserving the country, whereas at least lip service here and supposedly the intention here is to preserve the rights of the individual. So in China, it was forbidden to defend yourself if the government accused you of something because you were being disloyal to the government. It was not a question of you taking care of your own needs.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to shift down to the next question. Are China's actions compatible with a peaceful world order? Yes.
I'm not, I'm a beginner here on learning about China. But to go back to your initial question about competitor or enemy, am I still advising from China's position?
No, you're the China advisor in the administration of the United States.
So I'm trying to,
You're advising your president, whoever that is, how he's asked you these questions. You have to answer them.
okay,
He's got to set foreign policy, right? The president sets foreign policy, not Congress. Congress only gets to approve treaties. But foreign policy engagement is very different. The president is asked, are they a competitor or enemy? We have some answers said both. And that seems to be the consensus for the rest of you staying quiet because, as Sir Thomas More said, silence implies consent. What role does ideology play? We have two distinct ideologies, some with advantages, some with disadvantages, some with a different emphasis. But that's the way the two countries are set up. Now, are her actions compatible with a peaceful world order? And the corollary to that is, does the United States have a particular role in securing a peaceful world order? Because that's going to change how we react. If we say that China's actions are completely compatible with a peaceful world order, then that changes the basis on which we engage. Think of Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. Think of the South China Sea, Indonesia, Australia, Japan, the Philippines.
Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Tom Elliott out in Zoom land. And I raised my hand, but nobody saw it. But I will go back. I don't think that framing this in ideological sense really captures what China wants. They don't want to conquer the world or rule the world. They want to own it. And so this is fine. All of these actions could be framed as industrial espionage, not great power manipulation type espionage.
Okay, but Tom, I don't think you've quite answered the question about a peaceful world order. I get your understanding about the ideological goal that China may have set out. But the issue is, are their actions currently contributing to a peaceful world order? So I'll just raise this question for you. Support for Russia in their conflict in Ukraine. Their support for insurgent groups in Africa. Are those compatible with a peaceful world order? Is their action in the South China Sea consistent with that? All right, if your answer is no, that takes you in a different direction than if your answer is yes. Gary.
Well, I think that it's pretty clear that you have different objectives over the long haul. Certainly the objective that China has would be its own benefit, to its own benefit. Now it's participating in a lot of actions all around the world, doing what needs to be done, building roads and railroads and all this sort of thing. But at some point, it would be reasonable to expect that they anticipate and will demand some kind of benefit to themselves, some kind of return. I think that the United States has more typically tried to do a little more that was in keeping with the wishes of people in other countries. We haven't done a very good job of that necessarily, but I think that's sort of been a wish that we've had to do that, improve the, even in the banana plantations, that we're benefiting those people who are, harvesting bananas because we're operating a business down there.
Right.
But that's a very different approach that is benefiting the people themselves as a concept, as opposed to benefiting the nation as a concept.
Let me add to that, because again, when I showed you the 100,000 miles of roads and the 10,000 miles of railways, a couple of things have already been highlighted in recent reports. There was a collapse of a bridge in China itself. I forget the province, but it happened and it had just been completed 2 years ago. And a whole section of it fell down. The railways in Kenya, which were brought in by Chinese money, as well as other countries, have been found to be well behind their due date. They've often brought in Chinese laborers, which meant that Kenyans, for example, were not engaged in those building projects. And on top of it, the work has been incredibly shoddy. So again, I bring this out only because these are reports I see, all right? The stuff that I've happened to get across. So, as Gary points out, the other trap that has occurred in a number of situations is where the Chinese government has given money to a country which can't repay its debt. What happens as a consequence? They say, you owe us X, Y, and Z. It may mean we actually take territory. Think of France occupying the Ruhr after World War I and saying, you can't pay us the reparations, we're taking it out of your hide in coal and other minerals until that debt's paid. Yes?
China holds most of the US notes that we incur by running our budget at a constant deficit. If they called them in, we would be in major trouble. So we have essentially given the Chinese a lever for our own submission should they wish to use it.
Okay, that's a different issue, but you've raised an important point. I don't want to lose that thread, because that's going to come into play a little bit further on. Let's take a break, 10 minutes. We'll come back and address the rest of these questions. Take time to chat among yourselves. If you want to come up and ask me questions, that's fine. I am going to leave the recording going so that if you come up and talk to me, you're on record. We can turn the front lights on, please.
Travel to China.
Yes.
As Yogi Berra said, you can learn a lot by watching.
Oh, been there. It was really
And
amazing.
The thing that struck me is the country is incredibly inefficient.
Yes.
Beijing looked like a normal city, but when you got into Xi'an and Chengdu and Wuhan, there was one point I think we passed a half a mile's worth of high-rise apartments that are completed and they are not filled.
Exactly.
There was a road repair crew that we have that had at least 35 people working on it, and most of them had brooms. And I asked our guide, why is it done this way? I don't see the mechanization. He said, all these people have to do something
Right.
in support of the government. And when you take that to other areas of endeavor, this is a major exploitable weakness in the country.
Yes, it is. You've always brought in a whole host of very interesting observations, but I do want to say I'm trying to keep it constrained into a somewhat narrow focus.
The other point in terms of port domination was maybe, I think it was about 10 years ago, that a Chinese company was going to take over the port of Long Beach.
Yes,
And I mean, this is harnessed insanity.
Yes.
But in open society, you say, hey, it's mine, I want to sell it to the highest bidder.
right,
And we started the Chinese economy
yes,
by saying we can get cheaper labor over there. So the stuff they send in is designed by Americans, manufactured for an American market, but using Chinese labor. And it's,
I hear
we
you.
are short term in our planning. The Chinese think a quarter of a century.
I took a quotation from Lenin out that capitalists would sell us the rope we use to hang them. I took that quotation out. Yes, Gary?
Well, I just was wondering if the Chinese wish to get paid back for what they've invested in some of these countries where things have failed and so on and so forth. How are they going to collect it?
Well, I think there's part of it is that they have a decent sized merchant fleet. And because they've co-opted the government, they could say, I'll just use an example, which is not a good one. We could send tankers to Nigeria and get the oil and take that back to China. That's how you're going to pay us. We're not paying you for the oil.
I was thinking of some of those countries just saying, well, guess we're out of luck.
Yeah, well,
And, like, come and get it.
right.
That kind of thing, because I think that's how you would have to deal with that.
Well, that's part of the dynamic, and whether therefore, as a result of that, China says, well, if you're going to force us to force our way in, you have insurgent groups that we're going to fund, and we're going to destabilize your government.
Oh, I'm sure they'll be coming up with
Oh, yeah.
penalties all over the place.
Right.
But I was just thinking that,
Yeah.
if you're in a situation as such as these countries might be, they just say, well, take a hike.
Right.
Looks like you made a bad investment,
Well,
On the other hand, the United States says we're going to cancel U.S. aid because of the fact that we can cancel U.S. aid.
no, but you're going in a different direction again.
But it eliminates our ability to exert soft power.
No, there's a different way. No, I'm just saying, the government has much more flexibility than just US aid. And that's not to say that what the current administration is doing is, above board and great and, we all should be bowing down. That's not what I'm coming to, and that's why I don't want these conversations going in that direction, all right? Because it just gets people inflamed. What I want to do is make us focus on, you're the advisor, what are you telling them to do, and what are the repercussions that come from that? And you've already highlighted a couple, but I got to keep you quiet to let somebody else talk.
I also appreciate the way that you run the current events as compared with previous versions, because we focus on one particular issue instead of having a 2-hour rant.
Right. Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, good.
okay. Yeah. And feel free to turn pages if you want, by all means. The Epoch Times? Oh, it's right online, you can get it. And I found it as a print paper for free the first time I ran across it. They cover so many different things that we don't, and they have some amazing articles. They've run a whole series on, and they're running it currently, on the foundations of the Constitution stemming from Greece and Rome, and how the founders and those writing the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers studied Roman and Greek history and used it as a way of explaining what their positions were. It's fascinating. There's a whole series of them. And so this is just a way of just showing if you were going to invade, what's going to happen. And they have some junk too, so don't. Yes.
This, I imagine,
Yes,
But when I mine here,
but this is really the one that I want you to see because we're not familiar with this.
I've been to Covelo.
Oh, you have?
A high school classmate of mine had a marijuana farm there for 30 years. And he got run out.
Yep.
I've been there.
Yeah, the cartels are not nice people.
In addition to the bus stuff, there's also car manufacturing, counterfeit parts. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of some of them, but not probably to the depth you are aware.
So when we're building something, we buy parts and the parts come in. We have to test the parts to see if they do what they're supposed to.
There was a friend of mine who was involved in chip manufacturing 30 years ago, and he said exactly the same thing. You get these chips in, they're okay if 95% of them work. We are at 99.99, so it costs more, but it's going to work.
Make sure.
Exactly.
Defense.
Oh yeah, for everything. Okay. Speak up, Barbara. Don't be quiet. You gotta say.
Where do you give your historical lectures?
Here.
Okay.
Yeah.
After the Gaza one, I signed up for everyone I could. I think you're terrific.
Oh, well, thank you.
So I so admire.
Appreciate that. Okay, well, we'll resume because obviously a topic like this is extremely complicated. And as I've often said, we're not solving anything. If there's anything of importance that I hope all of us get out of this, and I certainly get it when I have to do the background work, is to learn something about what is happening that goes beyond what we usually can get in our traditional sources of media. Look a little more deeply. It's readily available. And fortunately, or unfortunately, AI gives you amazing access to some of the key principles you're interested in. And then you can finesse those answers and go further from there. So now, national security concerns. Does the United States have any national security concerns vis-a-vis the Far East? Why are we spending any time there? I was talking to someone I know from who's native Chinese but living in this country, who's basically asked that question to me. Why are you guys bothering? You know, that's China's area over there. Just let them do what they're going to do. Is that the position the United States should take, or should we deepen our involvement even further? And for what purpose? Yes.
I just want to let you guys know that if you're sitting up front here, you can just talk because these microphones will pick you up. But if you're back in here somewhere, I'll bring you a mic. And people on Zoom, please just speak up when you want to chip in, when you want to say something.
Anyone? Yes.
I think the national security concerns are really, really obvious. This whole business about the chips, the whole business about the buying of land, which is something I've never been able to understand, is why land in the United States is available to anybody who's got money anywhere in the world.
Right.
This does not make sense to me. And it seems to me this is a very, very significant sort of risk. So I think that there's no question that we have major security concerns because of what China's actually doing. How much Chinese land do we own?
Well, you know the restrictions on that. One of the other issues that I want to point out, and it goes to the heart, again, this is an observation, it's not a judgment. I want to make sure you understand I'm very neutral in these discussion groups. If you get me aside, I have my own opinions. How many people emigrate to China from around the world.
Any?
In comparison, how many emigrate to the United States? Willingly, unwillingly, but at least they want to be here. Lots.
Overwhelming.
So the point is, there's something intrinsically different between China and the United States. Now, as Gary, you mentioned earlier, China has a different agenda, not necessarily world domination where they are the single government over all the world. But at the same time, they are intrinsically and seriously focused on their own well-being. There's an article that I left here about China in the UN and their particular moves within the UN to take leadership positions in a number of committees. Currently, I think they hold 4, and it is unnatural. In the history of the UN, where usually no more than one country holds 2 positions, just to keep that in mind. Now, do we have any reason to want to support the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, any of those peripheral countries, Japan, who are within that area, South Korea? Do we have any reason for wanting to support them?
There, a lot of those places are tight trading partners. So, you know, we have manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing in Malaysia and the Philippines.
Right, exactly.
And Japan, actually.
So even if we tend to look at the economy of this country as somehow not the business of the government, it is the business of the government. And I think it was even Teddy Roosevelt who said, where business goes, the American government goes. Because we have a relationship that is important to our own self-sufficiency to some degree, but to our own prosperity more importantly, and how we can maintain ourselves as a nation, imperfect as we are. Now, what actions should we take related to Taiwan? Specifically, anyone? Come on, put a hand up. Yes.
I think we need to defend them for a certain amount of time because of the ship manufacturing. There was almost our sole source for a while. However, I believe that the past administration tried to open up other sources of that here in the States, but I don't think we're there yet.
No, we're not there yet, but we are doing it. That's a current initiative. All right, so I'm going to turn the question back to you. Suppose we no longer rely on Taiwan for chip manufacturing. Do we have any other reason to support them? Or if China says we're going to invade Taiwan, we just say, go for it.
I'm sure there are other reasons.
Well, you're the China advisor.
Well, I have to leave it to my colleagues.
Yes.
Well, Taiwan they're governed quite differently, right? I mean,
Yes.
they're more democratic, I'd say,
Yes.
than we are. So that might be a somewhat ideological reason to defend them.
You see, but that's an important question. Do we, as the United States, have any interest in other, and we'll call them democratic countries, at least as we define that term? It is that somehow up to us to do that. We've been doing that since World War II. Is it time to change where we just say, the hell with the rest of you? Yes.
Well, the problem is we have done that, but we haven't always succeeded.
Right.
So I think we have to be really careful that we don't start doing something that we can't succeed at.
Right.
That's just going to cost a ton of money, get a lot of people killed. You know,
Yep, we've been down that
we
road
got to be careful about that.
very much in our recent history. Okay, so now I'm going to change it to a little bit more degree. What about our support for the Philippines, for Vietnam? Should we support them? Should we support Malaysia? Should we support Brunei? What support should we give to Australia, which is directly beneath that second island chain?
I think it makes sense to support democracies wherever they function in the world. It seems to me that that would be a good line to draw. If you are a democratic country governed by a democratic principles, we will support you. And we would also hope, and maybe, I'm not sure how to put the screws on them, but they would be supporting us too. Because it seems to me that it would be important for democratic organizations, democratic governments to unite in warding off governments that are not democratic.
And I'm going to put a plug in for current events that I think is in the next cycle, where I'm going to introduce the issue of NATO, because it speaks directly to the heart of what you've just outlined. Okay, should we build up military resources in the Far East, Robert?
We should give each of these countries the ability and resources they need to defend themselves, but never put our own boots on the ground. So we will support your willingness to defend yourself, but you're going to have to do it without US troops.
Okay. Oops, where did that come from? Sorry. Right, before you bring in the thing, I just want to raise a question. Robert, you don't have to answer this one, all right? What does that mean materially? Does the Philippines have a navy to which we could give weapons, which would be sufficient to allow the Philippines to hold on to their economic zone? Remember that not very long ago, the Philippines took China to the International Court at The Hague on a very specific issue related to Chinese occupation of shoals and small islands that Philippines said were in our economic zone. The Hague said the Philippines win. What did China say? Up yours.
Screw you.
What are you going to do about it? So, when we talk about giving them weapons to defend themselves, you're dealing with a series of issues where we, with our current shipbuilding capacity being 1/10 that of China, given the particular circumstances of terrain, which involves sea as well as land when we talk about terrain, that we do not have the resources where we can take our Navy ships and give them. We can't build them. We don't have that capacity. It's going to take us years to get there. Yes.
We already have boots on the ground in South Korea. I don't know, I think we probably still have some in Japan and the Philippines.
Yes. The Philippines, we've been in and out, depending on who's in charge. I have a guy in the back.
Which she's gonna.
Start with him and then we'll come up front. I don't want her to not be able to speak.
Yes, we do already have significant military resources in the Far East. There's an aircraft carrier group stationed, they're home ported in Yokosuka, Japan. So we have a lot there already. What do you mean by, I'm not certain what would be building up how much more we would want to build up?
Well, I'm going to interpret what Robert was saying is we don't use our people. He wants someone else to be the crews of those ships, but to train up a crew to use an aircraft carrier. No, I understand. Go ahead.
Yes, we have a 7th Fleet home port Yokosuka,
Yes.
and Okinawa has a Marine Corps base.
Yes.
And some of went to the Saipan, Guam, or I forgot.
Yes,
which
in
one.
Guam.
Yes, and one more Air Force base at the Northern District, Misawa, and the Marine base in Iwakuni.
Yes.
We have a lots of military base in Japan, and now Japanese Self-Defense Agency, they are very helpful.
Yes.
To the United States.
And Japan is actually building up its military at an unprecedented level. I mentioned that on a slide earlier. Yes, Robert?
I disagree about your premise. Ships? Why have ships when you can have drones. And drones have proven very effective in Ukraine. They're cheap, they have range, they seem to be non-detectable. Sputnik drones.
Well, I appreciate your emphasis on that. There are a lot of issues related to drones, both good and bad, that I don't want to go into. That gets us too much in the weeds. But it's an interesting element, and it certainly is going to be part and parcel of our sales to other countries.
Bob, you're right. The drones are very effective in when you get into combat, but if you just want to show your strength, show the flag, there's nothing like a great big great Navy ship off the shore.
Yes, Gary?
Well, since I'm giving advice to our government,
Yes.
what I would suggest is that we might try to take a long-term approach, not an immediate approach, but a long-term approach. And so that what we would be trying to do is to establish a concept and help to build on that concept of long-term democracies supporting other democracies, starting from where we are now, but doing what we need to do with these countries that are democratic, that they shall have to do some things to improve their capacity for self-defense, for which we will also help.
All right, there's an interesting part of it, and I'm not being critical, I'm making an observation. That's still pretty vague. So I'm going to give you some specifics, both short-term to answer what Robert was talking about as you. Anti-ship missiles, okay? We manufacture them, sell them to Taiwan. What's the message to China? Don't try to invade, right? Another person I talked to said, well, we'll send mines over so that the Taiwanese can mine their ports in the concern if they're going to be invaded, or mine the beaches where the attacks may occur. How is China going to react to that? So remember, this is a back and forth. This is a ping pong game, and we know that the Chinese are very good at ping pong. So these are interesting questions for us to ponder, because our administrations, plural, have been dealing with this since the 1970s. And as we look forward to the coming administrations, however they're constructed, these are questions which are going to be right up in front of them. Does Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, and I should call it also South Asia, and Africa, raise concerns for us? Should we become more globally engaged in Africa? We just got kicked out of Niger. You may not remember that. Why did we get kicked out? Because there was a coup by a military group to try to stabilize that nation in the face of jihadist action, particularly Boko Haram, and others. And because we have a law that says if it's a military junta that's taken over, we got to take our forces out of there. And the French left Chad and the Sahel as an example. And those are being taken over. You can read it as you wish, by jihadist groups. And where do they get their money? Well, Iran doesn't have the money anymore. So where do they get their resources? So keep that in mind. We talked about banning Chinese ownership of farmland. And yes.
Yeah, after I saw that picture in that magazine where they have gardens in the United States, I counted 26 of them, and they were right by forts. And you know, what are they going to do? Why are they doing this? Are they going to take care of the forts, or are they really eating the vegetables? And it's like, get out. We don't need it.
Right. There are a lot of different thoughts on that. Yes.
Well, a lot of our viewpoint has been shaped by the beginning of World War II and Chamberlain versus Churchill and what you let people get away with. But it seems clear that with Africa and the Far East that China is positioning itself strategically, whether they are going to intend to follow through on what they're doing, but, you know, even this farmland next to military installations, back when I was young, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can't have missiles that are, but we are allowing a lot of strategic alliances and position and installations to go around the world so that if they do decide to take over the world, we're going to be at a slight disadvantage.
The one thing I think China, I've never seen anything on this particular element, so maybe it's not a direct answer. I do not believe, and I have not seen anything that would suggest the CCP allowing anyone to control any of their nuclear weapons anywhere but in China itself. They don't trust anybody to be able to manage that scenario. Now, I'm going to go to one other thing. Wait a minute. Okay, go ahead.
Do they have lunar submarines?
They are working on them. My understanding is they may have launched one or two. I don't know the real status. They don't have a bunch. But the idea is, and if you want an interesting show to watch, I think it's on either Amazon or Netflix. It's called House of Dynamite. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching because it has to do with a single missile, ballistic missile launched out of the Pacific, which is going to impact Chicago. And the question is, what do we do about it? And it's a very interesting, very well done movie. Now, I'm going to hit this one and then there's something more. Should the US stop Chinese students from attending school? I just heard, and I didn't check it, so this is nothing more than true hearsay, that the current administration was going to allow, I don't know, 100,000 Chinese students to come to the US to study. All right, put that aside, that's just something I heard. But should we stop Chinese students from attending school? And I'll give you an example. For those of you who've had links with BU, one of the connections BU has had with mainland China has been to bring students in, and they also have had something called the Confucius Institute, which sounds very benign. But recently, and that is within the past couple of years, there's been a real drive to recognize how insidious, how in a sense perverse, particularly by using the name Confucius, to get students into American universities and educate them. And I already talked about the police force and intimidation issues, which are on record. That's not something I've made up. If we view China simply as a competitor, then it would seem as though we certainly could allow Chinese students to come to the United States and be educated. If we view them as an enemy, that flips the conversation. Yes, Gail.
I'm going to advise that we keep letting them in because that helps understanding between the two countries. And all these other points on here are sort of telling me that if we do not engage in much better diplomacy, war is just not something you really want to entertain in any way, shape, or form with China. You just don't. So we have to push, like the very first thing, are we a competitor or an enemy? How come it doesn't say, well, couldn't we be, aren't we collaborators and friends? You know, we did purposely, when I was at IBM, you know, we did purposely train their engineers and send manufacturing to China, and we buy a lot of stuff from China. We are tight trading partners. And by the way, if you maintain tight trade relations with a country, it's a lot less likely you're going to go to war because you're both benefiting from trading.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, but I will just point out two historical issues. The same was said before the breakout of World War I. I'll call it Europeanization / globalization of trade was thought to be of sufficient power and import that it would benefit no country to go to war. And yet they went to war. Now, the same could be said of what was going on in the lead up to World War II. Now, those are different conflicts from Korea, even Vietnam, even Afghanistan and Iraq. But the point I'm trying to make, and I think you raise a good point, is that if you are interdependent on trade, that can help lessen the difficulties of engaging with each other in those areas where you have differences. That doesn't mean you're necessarily going to compromise. And maybe that brings us back to the issue of competitor or enemy, depending on the front that you're addressing. But currently, again, you are the advisors, all right? You're the ones who have to ask, or have been asked by the president, what are you going to do? Let me go back. Now I'm going to raise a question. I pointed out the demographics facing China over the next 75 years. Different people writing articles about the effect of demographics, as well as detailing their perceptions of what the Chinese economy really is doing, as opposed to what they report it doing, which is at variance. Does the declining population change the dynamics within China to move her to be more aggressive or less aggressive? And if on top of that, Xi is beginning to feel the rumblings of his foundation and begins to think, you know something? There are people here who want to get rid of me. And getting rid of me doesn't mean you go on vacation, except it's permanent. So does that change how we're going to look forward over the next 10 years? Maybe less if Xi really finds himself in deep trouble. What would, and now you get to speculate if you were the Chinese government, if you were Xi, and say, do I walk quietly, go out with a bang or a whimper? How do I manage that? And if you now are in the United States witnessing this, how do you respond? Yes.
So we actually have the same thing happening to us. We are losing population slowly. Our population has stagnated. So in that situation, whether you're US, China, or anybody else, one logical thing to do would be more immigrants.
Right, and that's what's kept our population where it is or growing a bit. But again, then you have to ask yourself, remember, China, I asked earlier, how many of us know anything about immigration into China? So, the other question, yes, go ahead.
Historically, there was immigration into China after a lot of Russian emigres after the communist revolution of 1917.
Yes, but they didn't stay. So they were refugees, but they weren't welcome and they didn't linger. And so when we look at, although the ethnicities throughout China is amazingly mixed, just as the dialects are amazingly mixed, we come back to that fundamental question. Do you have a multicultural system that encourages people to come and live there or not? So the issue is, if the Chinese economy begins to shrink seriously because of its declining population and workforce, where do we go from there?
Sean has something to say.
I just said they don't have immigrants because they have big population, you know. That's one answer.
Right, because it's big now, but if it shrunk, that might change their tune, right?
Right,
That's why they control families'
yes.
size.
So the issue is, even though they've gotten rid of the one-child law, they've been unable to build up the population. It's not like suddenly we're going to have 3 or 4 kids. It just isn't built into the system. That's why the projections, and they're only projections, of course, seem as dire as they are. So now let's ask another question. Let's suppose, and again, this is all now speculation. Let's suppose that she says, there's only one way for me to retain power. And I do that by a foreign engagement. What is one of the things that Xi has spoken about from the very beginning of his presidency? Taiwan will be part of China. So now he's beginning to see that he might lose his place. And he says, we have a window of opportunity before the US is able to militarize properly, before Japan builds up its self-defense forces, before these other countries are able to do their thing to protect themselves. Remember, Australia wants to buy a bunch of submarines, right? Why? Because they can interdict trade, they can be silent, they can be a threat, right? So China says, listen, we got to take them on. And now what you see them doing is gathering forces at the various ports, like look at that map that I left up here, in preparation for an amphibious assault on Taiwan. Hasn't happened yet. Now what do you tell the president? You're the advisor. You can't be silent. All right? The question is that you see China marshaling its forces for an amphibious operation against Taiwan.
Find out from Taiwan what they need.
All right? Can you get it to them quickly enough? And what is it that you think they need? Again, this is a game now. It's just a game, all right? But it could be reality in the next 6 months, a year, 2 years.
Well, you could send in the 7th Fleet into the Formosa Strait
Right?
as a deterrent.
So basically just say we're going to go there and we're going to stay there until you step down. Because if now you wish to engage us, that brings the full power of the United States into the conflict. Okay? Okay.
But will China see that as aggression? Then won't that start something that we might not want to start?
Well, you're asking me a question. I got to turn those questions back to you guys and kind of let you weigh in. But I'll put it this way. Suppose China's answer is much of what, say, Iran did. Okay. We send out these little fast craft with some missiles on them and we attack a destroyer. What are you going to do about it? You're going to launch a nuclear war over that? No? Is it worth it?
If I had to just stay in power, I would.
Okay. So one is to raise the threshold from DEFCON 3 to DEFCON 1.
The most important thing for me in China is to stay in power.
Yeah.
And if it might cost 100 million other lives, at least I'm still in power.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm his advisor.
Yes.
China plays a long game.
Michael? Oh,
Oh, wait just a moment before chiming in. We have one other person answering a question, then pick up. Go ahead.
China plays a very long game. China's not going to invade Taiwan.
No, wait a minute. You're already changing the premise of my situation.
Oh, I was giving advice.
No, the point is that China has already marshaled forces at its ports in preparation for an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. So the question is, how do you react? Go ahead on Zoom land. Uh-oh.
Yeah, how about all-out economic retaliation? You've put in the Seventh Fleet. I mean, they could invoke sanctions on anybody who does not condemn or oppose the U.S. intervention.
Okay, now, Tom, just a question. When you say send in the Seventh Fleet, we have one
Well,
piece
that
of
was
advice
the,
that says send it into the Taiwan Strait. Is that what
Yeah.
you're talking about, or outside of that?
in the Formosa Strait, it says what you're saying to China by doing that is, if you're going to land on Taiwan, you got to go through us first.
Right. All right. Now, I
And
will, go ahead, I'm
do,
sorry.
do they really have to attack the Seventh Fleet, or can they attack us economically?
All right. The question,
You know, and how long would the population in the U.S. support an economic downturn for the sake of Taiwan?
okay, I don't have an answer to that, Tom, but I will put this
Yeah.
piece of information out in front of everyone here. No sane admiral would send the Seventh Fleet into the Taiwan Straits.
Oh.
That makes it nothing more than a big target. And you can use conventional weapons basically to destroy the Seventh Fleet. They have such a capacity for land-based missiles to attack the sea, especially in a confined area, and such a preponderance of aircraft that despite what you may think, that fleet would be nothing more than another Iron Bottom Sound. No admiral would agree to that. There, right now, our initiatives from a naval strategic standpoint is to stand off in the large Pacific areas east of Taiwan, not to get into that close. We'll send a destroyer through, but we're not going to send a fleet. Yes.
If I was in charge of people in our government who are thinking about what to do in these situations, I would be planning cyber attacks. And if I were in the Chinese government, I'd be doing the same thing.
Yes.
Because nobody wants nuclear weapons to come into play, because as soon as those come into play, that's the end of the world as we know it.
Right.
And I hope most world leaders know that.
Yes,
So-
indeed. Yeah, I agree with you on that point. And actually, cyber attacks are an ongoing issue, especially in the United States. I don't know what our responses have been. I would assume that we're not sitting back and just taking the blow, that we're trying to do the same in return. So let's say that there is an attempt at balancing. One of the issues that you're emphasizing, Gail, in that particular comment is that somehow this shuts down certain abilities you have in your economy to function properly. Within that context, I have no idea how much of an effect that would have nor how long it would take. Some of it could be literally instantaneous if you can shut down an electrical grid. And once that's done, you are really up the creek, so to speak. Is that enough if Xi is saying, I've mustered all these forces in the ports and I'm going to stand down? What concession do I reap if I do that? But if I actually invade Taiwan, if I now have troops on Taiwan, is there anything else you can do about it? And we've had one suggestion that we say, tough, Taiwan just doesn't matter that much. Okay, let it go. It's not worth our losing potentially thousands, if not even millions, if this escalates. Any other comments in that regard? Yes.
Following up on your point, we let Crimea go, and what was the result? Further invasions.
Yeah. All right, so history does have a way of teaching us some lessons.
I believe that Taiwan presently is doing a lot to try to protect themselves from from the presence of Chinese ground troops.
Yes.
Okay, and that's where I was saying that I think that we should be trying to do everything we can to help them in their endeavor to do that, and I think we have the capacity for that.
Right. And I think that's where Robert made the mention about drones, because you can't take a large transport ship and beach it. I don't think they have LSTs. So from the standpoint of how you get from ship to shore means small craft. Some people have characterized that if the Chinese try to invade Taiwan, it'll be the million-man swim because of the possibilities of taking out shipping. But remember, that's still an assumption, all right? And so the question really in front of us is, if we see it gearing up, what can the United States do in the short term? And that's where movement of the 7th Fleet is, I think, a reasonable suggestion. I just wouldn't put it in the Taiwan Strait, because I think I'd be shot by my admiral. Yes?
I think vigilance is important, and realize that every 90 minutes we pass over the Chinese ports, looking down, we know if someone has crossed the street at that time.
Right.
So maintaining the vigilance, we are going to know months in advance if China is actually marshaling something. And that also tells us we really don't care if the Chinese own land next to our bases, because you're just looking inside, because every 90 minutes they're passing over them, looking down.
Now, we've only got a few minutes left, and I'm going to really throw a big monkey wrench into the rest of this discussion, all right? And again, this is somewhat fanciful. Authors writing fiction have sometimes gone down this path, and it's kind of a fun read. It's sort of like reading Tom Clancy, and getting an idea of what could happen. Let's suppose for the moment that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine ends, but Russia, now having a wartime economy, tries to struggle back to a more peacetime economy and rebuild costs that have been extraordinary. I showed some of that information on the slides on Ukraine. China now sees that Eastern Russia is basically very weak. And they say, guess what? Here's another opportunity. Why don't we just go north? Because the Russians stole all that land from us back in the time of Peter the Great and in the 1800s and so on, when they marched off to the Pacific. That's our land. Now suppose China starts mustering troops on the Russian border. Remember, they've already come to blows across the Amur River in the past. It's been a good while, but they did it. Does the United States end up saying, tough bananas, Russia, you're on your own for this one, right? Or is there a geopolitical or strategic issue that the United States must find as saying, we can't let that happen? Anyone?
That's gonna be your next class. We don't have time.
All right, well,
I would say, yes,
okay,
yes. Our dreams have come true. They're gonna kill each other off.
there you go. That reminds me of what Stalin used to say about the Eastern Front, was that the capitalist countries, Britain, the United States in particular, want the two of them to so weaken each other that neither will be a threat to the geopolitical order. Open it up to any comments, questions, anything other than critiquing any particular administration. It's not where I want these conversations to go. I know we all have feelings about it, and that's fine. I'm not here to deal with that. I'm here for a different reason. Yes?
I have a question. Do we own land in China next to bases?
No.
Not at all.
As far as I know, none.
Maybe we just don't know.
Well, it's conceivable, but I have to say that given the way in which the CCP controls the country, that it would be unbelievable to me that they would permit us to own land next to a base. I just can't see them ever agreeing to that. Remember what the primary philosophy is. It's the Chinese Communist Party dominates. That's what matters. Everything else is subordinate to the party. Now, even though they've changed some of their economic basis to a sort of, I'll call it a pseudo-capitalism, they're still in charge of everything. And if they don't like what you're doing, they'll make you pay for it, one way or another. You have to remember, during the COVID crisis in China, they were sealing people in their apartments. Okay?
And my friend who was 93 days in her apartment, I asked her, why in the world, what's your thinking there? She said, it's for the greater good.
Yes. Robert?
Remember, in a communist society, land is collectively owned. There is no individual ownership of land.
Well, but what's different is sort of take federal land that we have in this country, of which there's a great proportion out west. Theoretically, we all own that, but we don't control it as individuals. It's all controlled through our representatives in government. The same is true there. You can say it belongs to the people, but it only can be administered by the party. Ergo, we make the decisions about what happens to it. You don't. And if we decide we don't like what you're doing, we will make you change.
Well,
Yes.
there is private ownership of land, at least condo apartments and so forth in China now.
Yes, it's privately owned insofar, right, as you paid for it, like the apartments and things. Shalon's mom had an apartment.
They own the building, but not land. The land is the government.
Right.
So you can use for 70 years, but after 70 years, we don't know what's happened. But that's why the Chinese property, the house is no charge tax, no property tax. That's what.
Right. So again, the nuances of how you retain control, right? And if they decided for some reason that your presence there was not acceptable to the party, you can be removed. Okay? Anything else? Other questions, comments, anything? Yes?
This is a little off the wall. Israel has nuclear weapons, right?
We believe so. They've never admitted it, but we're pretty sure they do.
And back in the day, when we speculated on how did they develop these nuclear weapons, one of the speculations was that there was a cooperation between Taiwan, Israel, and South Africa to support the development. Does Taiwan have nuclear weapons?
We don't know. There's nothing I've seen that even hints that they do. And a nuclear exchange between Taiwan and China would basically annihilate Taiwan. So I don't know what purpose that would be other than if you were to use it to strike an invasion fleet with a nuclear weapon, and you could do a great deal of damage that way. I just don't have any information on that at all, Greg. Yes, Robert.
China plays a very long-term game.
Yes.
In the eyes of the world, we are on a 4-year cycle. We go from administration to administration. Sometimes we like NATO, sometimes we don't like NATO.
Right.
Sometimes we like Africa, sometimes we don't like Africa.
Right.
If we are going to have some kind of continuous presence to offset China's influence, we can't be on a 4-year cycle.
Well, again, you're raising a very complex issue, and I absolutely respect that comment, but I have to put it in this context. What are you willing to give up in order to not have that 4-year cycle? And I'll leave it there because otherwise Robert gets the last word and I can't afford that. Is that if you're willing to give up a 4-year cycle in exchange for greater stability, which you perceive to be helpful, does that mean you've given up certain liberties and rights and ways to change with changing circumstances? And I'll put it in this context for us so we all keep this very clearly in mind. In 1864, we were in a terrible civil war. We held an election for the president. In 1944, we were in the midst of a terrible world conflict. We held an election. In 1916, we weren't in it yet. But the mantra from the Wilson campaign was, he kept us out of war. And a year and a half later, we were in it. So the issue of stability, political stability, has certain attractions to it. And that indeed is why monarchies lasted for millennia, thousands of years.
That's why she doesn't have to face election.
Well, he does in a different context, because his position has become increasingly undermined. And there's now another person who is really stepping up to remove his advisors and political appointees. Yes?
Yes, China takes a long position, but as you posited, Xi cannot.
That's also another part. Well, thank you all again very much for attending these conferences. I really appreciate it. I do want you all to engage. Don't feel that what you have in your mind is somehow not valued here. It truly is. But it's generic, not current in terms of our own political status. Thank you again.
See you again. See you next year. Next year.